They said they were stretched thin, that the economy was rough, that retirement savings weren't what they used to be, that they'd love to help, but their hands were tied. That's what my parents told me when my daughter was 8 years old and the doctor said she needed a liver transplant. She was 8. She liked painting rocks and leaving them on the front porch of strangers. She called our cat Mr. Buttons, even though we'd named him something else entirely. She had this laugh that started silent, her whole body shaking before any sound came out. And by the time the sound finally arrived, everyone in the room was already laughing with her, even if they hadn't heard the joke. Her name was Nadia. I need you to remember that name. I was 31 when her diagnosis came. Primary sclerosing cholangitis, a disease that destroys the bile ducts in the liver. Progressive, no cure except transplant. The specialist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto sat across from me and my husband Callum and explained what needed to happen. There was a wait list. There was a living donor option if we could find a match. And there was the cost of the workup, the pre-transplant evaluation, the medications to keep her stable while we waited. OHIP covered the surgery itself. It didn't cover everything that came before. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I understood all of it in that first meeting. I left that office and sat in the parking garage on the cold concrete beside our car for about 15 minutes before Callum found me. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me, and we stayed there until we could both breathe normally again. Then we made a list. The living donor evaluation alone was close to $18,000 out of pocket for travel, accommodation, and the testing not covered by provincial insurance. We were in a smaller city then, 4 hours from Toronto, which meant hotels, gas, parking, weeks away from work. Callum was freelance. I worked part-time at a dental office while Nadia was in school. We had a small emergency fund. It evaporated in the first 2 months. I called my parents in March. My mother answered. I explained everything, the timeline, the numbers, what we needed and when. I told her I wasn't asking for all of it, just anything they could manage, a loan even, whatever helped us get through the evaluation phase so we could get Nadia on the living donor list while we also waited on the deceased donor registry. There was a pause. Then my mother said, "Sweetheart, your father and I are on a fixed income. You know how things has been since he retired. We want to help, we do, but we just don't have it right now." I said I understood. I didn't understand. But I said it. My younger brother was on the phone with my father 2 days later. According to my brother's own account later, he told me my father had said, "Your sister's situation is very hard. We're praying for them." That was the sum of it. My parents lived 40 minutes away from us. They had lived in the same house for 26 years. They drove a car that was 3 years old. They took a winter trip to Arizona every single year to stay at a timeshare they'd owned for over a decade. But they were stretched thin. I didn't push. I had a sick daughter and no energy left for a fight. I couldn't afford emotionally. Callum's parents helped where they could, a few $1,000s a week of driving Nadia to appointments so we didn't have to pull her brother out of school again. My co-workers at the dental office put together a fundraiser. Our neighbours organised a silent auction. Strangers from a Facebook group for liver disease families sent e-transfers with notes that said things like, "From one parent to another, and give Nadia a hug from us." We raised over $90,000. It still wasn't enough to bridge every gap. The timing was wrong. The match we'd hoped for fell through. Nadia deteriorated faster than the team had anticipated. She died on a Wednesday in November. The morning light was coming in sideways through the hospital blinds, making these thin orange lines across her blanket. Callum was on one side of her bed and I was on the other. She'd been unconscious for 2 days. She was 8 years old. I don't remember driving home from the hospital. I remember standing in the kitchen and noticing that someone had left a mug on the counter with a tea bag still in it. And I thought, I should throw that out, and then I sat down on the floor and didn't move for a very long time. My parents came to the funeral. My mother cried. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "She's at peace now." I nodded. I didn't know what else to do with my face. The next 2 years are difficult to explain. Grief isn't linear, and I won't pretend it was. There were months where I functioned well, went back to work, cooked dinner, laughed at things on TV, watched my son Eli grow taller and funnier and more himself. And there were months where I couldn't listen to any music because every song felt like it was about Nadia, even songs that objectively had nothing to do with her. My relationship with my parents became polite and distant. We saw them at Christmas. We talked on the phone occasionally. I stopped expecting anything from them emotionally and just managed the surface of it. Callum was angrier than I was for longer. He'd lost a daughter too, but he'd also watched me call my parents and beg, and he never forgot what they'd said. My brother was still close with my parents. He'd always been the one who called every week, who fixed things around the house on weekends, who showed up. I never resented him for it. He was just built differently than me, more present, more patient with them. His name is Marcus. He's 4 years younger than me, works in commercial real estate in Mississauga, does well for himself. He'd gotten married 2 years after Nadia died, a small wedding at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake. Callum and I were there. It was a beautiful day. I found out about the house 14 months after the wedding. It came out the way these things usually do, sideways, accidentally, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. I was on the phone with my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who'd always been more open than my mother. She mentioned something about Marcus and his wife settling into the new place, how it must be such a relief to have more space now that they were talking about starting a family. I said, "Oh, they moved?" She said, "Yes, into the house your parents bought them. Did you not know?" I said I must have forgotten. I hadn't forgotten. No one had told me. I got off the phone and sat very still for a minute. Then I called Marcus. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I asked him directly, no warm-up, no small talk. "Did Mum and Dad buy you a house?" There was a pause long enough to answer the question. "It was a gift," he said, "for the wedding. They didn't want it to be a big thing." "What did they pay?" Another pause. "I don't think I should, Marcus." He told me. My parents had given him and his wife $280,000 toward the purchase of a house in Oakville, a down payment large enough to make the mortgage manageable on their income. The money had come from a combination of savings and the sale of a rental property my parents had owned since before I was born, a property I had never known about because they had never mentioned it. The rental property. My parents owned a rental property. While they were telling me they were on a fixed income, they were collecting rent on a property they had owned for over 3 decades. While I was putting up a Facebook fundraiser and accepting $20 donations from strangers, they had an asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, while Nadia was dying. I didn't call my parents that night. I couldn't trust what would come out of my mouth. I told Callum, and he went very quiet, in the way he gets when something hits him too hard for words. Then he got up, went out to the garage, and I heard him in there for a long time, just moving things around. When he came back in, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of Eli's bed and watched him sleep. He was 11 by then, all elbows and untied shoelaces, a little frown on his face, even unconscious, like he was solving something in his dreams. He looked like Callum. He had Nadia's nose. I thought about her for a long time. Then I went to bed. I spent 3 weeks sitting with it before I did anything. I talked to a counsellor I'd been seeing on and off since Nadia died. I talked to one friend who'd known me since university and who I trusted not to tell me what I wanted to hear. I didn't talk to Marcus again during that time, and I didn't call my parents. What I kept coming back to was this. They had chosen. It wasn't that they didn't have it. They had looked at what they had, and they had decided what it was for. And Nadia had not made the list. Their granddaughter, 8 years old, dying of a liver disease. She had not made the list. But a down payment on a house in Oakville had. That's not a financial situation. That's a value system. I drove to my parents' house on a Saturday morning in early spring. Callum offered to come. I said I needed to do it alone. My mother opened the door and looked surprised and pleased to see me. She said she'd just made coffee. My father was in the living room with the newspaper. I sat down at the kitchen table. My mother poured 2 mugs and sat across from me. My father came in when he heard my voice and leaned against the counter. I told them what I knew. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that, because I'd spent 20 years thinking of myself as someone who yelled when she was angry, and I didn't yell once. I just said it all, plainly. The rental property, the $280,000, the phone call in March when my mother said their hands were tied, the $18,000 evaluation cost. Nadia. My mother started to cry before I finished. My father said, "We thought the fundraising was going well." I looked at him for a long moment. "She died, Dad," he said. "We know that. We know. You had the money." My mother said, "We were trying to be fair. We'd already been helping you your whole lives in different ways. And Marcus had never held up my hand." I didn't want to hear the sentence finished. I told them I wasn't there to get an apology, because I didn't think an apology was going to do anything useful for me at this point. I told them I was there because I needed them to know that I knew, and I needed to stop carrying this alone. And I told them that I didn't know what our relationship looked like from here, but it was going to look different. Then I got up, put my mug in the sink, and left. I cried in the car for about 20 minutes. Then I called Callum and told him it was done. He said, "Come home." So I did. The call came 18 months later, on a Tuesday evening in October. It was my mother. She was crying before she got a word out. That kind of crying where you can hear how long someone has been holding it before they called. My father had been having episodes. Numbness down his left side, then chest pain, then a collapse at the hardware stall. They'd called an ambulance. At the hospital in Hamilton, the cardiologist had found a significant blockage and significant damage. He needed bypass surgery, the kind that was complex enough that the surgeon at their local hospital had recommended they get to a larger centre. And then she said it. She said the cardiologist at the specialist centre had been assigned based on the referral. She didn't know this when she agreed to the transfer. The cardiologist was Callum. Callum, my husband, the man who had sat on a parking garage floor with me when we first found out about Nadia, the man who had gone into the garage and moved things around for an hour the night I told him about the rental property. Callum, who had watched my parents tell us they had nothing to give, and then watched our daughter die. He was one of the cardiologists attached to the surgical team that would be working with my father. My mother didn't know how to ask the question she was asking. She kept starting sentences and stopping them. Finally, she just said, "I don't know what to do. I don't know if this is, I don't know if he would." I said, "Mom, stop." I told her I'd call her back. I hung up and found Callum in the kitchen making pasta. I told him. He stopped stirring and stood there with his back to me for a moment. Then he turned around. His face was very steady. He said, "You know I'm going to do my job." I said, "I know." He said, "That was never going to be a question." I said, "I know that too." He turned back to the pasta. I sat at the table. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night, but somewhere around 11, after Eli had gone to bed, Callum came and sat next to me on the couch and took my hand. Neither of us said anything. We just stayed like that. I called my mother back the next morning. She answered on the first ring. She'd clearly been awake all night. I could hear it. I told her that Callum would do his job the same way he did for every patient, that she didn't need to worry about that, and that my father was in good hands. I told her the hospital he was being transferred to was one of the best cardiac centres in the province, and that was true regardless of any of what had happened between us. She started crying again. She kept saying, "Thank you," in a way that made me want to end the call, not because I was cold, but because it felt like she was thanking me for something I hadn't done, attributing some kind of grace to me that I wasn't sure I'd actually extended. Callum was part of a team. He scrubbed in. The surgery took 6 hours. My father survived. I visited him in the hospital 3 days post-surgery. He was pale and smaller looking than I remembered, which is what hospitals do to people, make them look like earlier, more fragile versions of themselves. He had tubes and monitors and a bruise along his jaw from where he'd hit the floor at the hardware store. He looked at me when I walked in, and his eyes got wet immediately. I pulled a chair up beside his bed. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Just that. No qualifiers, no context, no "we thought" or "we were trying to." Just, "I'm sorry." I nodded. I told him I was glad he was okay. And I meant it. I did mean it. Not in the way that closes a wound. I don't think wounds like this close, but in the way that allows you to be a person who is glad that another person is alive, even when the grief underneath is still fully intact. I drove home through November rain, the highway wet and orange with headlights coming the other direction. I thought about Nadia the whole way. I thought about the morning she died, the sideways light through the hospital blinds. I thought about the rock painting and Mr. Buttons and that silent shake laugh. I thought about the $18,000 and the rental property and the $280,000 house in Oakville. I thought about Callum scrubbing in. I thought about the fact that I would never stop grieving her, that none of this, not the confrontation, not the surgery, not my father's "I'm sorry," erased a single hour of what we had lost. But I also thought about Eli at home, making something complicated and probably inedible for dinner because he'd decided this was the week he was going to learn to cook. I thought about Callum's hands when he takes mine. I thought about the way grief and ordinary life exist in the same body at the same time, and how strange and relentless and necessary it is to keep going. My parents sold the Oakville house, not their own, but they liquidated what remained of the rental property proceeds and made a donation to the Sick Kids Liver Transplant Research Fund. My mother called to tell me. I didn't know what to say, so I said thank you, and I meant that too, in the complicated way I'd learned to mean things. Marcus and I talked, eventually. It took a long time, and it wasn't easy, and I don't think either of us came away from the conversation feeling good, exactly. But we came away still talking. That's something. My father goes to cardiac rehab every Tuesday and Thursday. He's doing well. I still sometimes drive past the hospital where Nadia died. I never plan to. It's just on certain routes, and I don't always think ahead. When I pass it, I don't look away anymore. I used to. Now I just let myself see it. She would be 13 this spring. Probably eye-rolling at everything I say. Probably still painting rocks. Every morning, when the light comes in through the kitchen window at that particular sideways angle, I think, there she is. And then I make coffee, and I start the day. I've thought a lot about the word choice. Not in the abstract way, not as a concept, but in the specific, granular way it showed up in this story. The choice my parents made when they said their hands were tied. The choice they made when they signed over $280,000 to my brother, while strangers were sending me $20 with notes that said praying for Nadia. These weren't accidents, they were decisions made quietly, behind closed doors, with full knowledge of what was happening to my daughter. And then there was Callum's choice. He didn't make a production of it. When I told him he was assigned to my father's surgical team, he just turned around from the stove and said, "You know I'm going to do my job." No deliberation, no leverage. He just did what he'd always done, which was show up as the person he actually was. That's something I've been thinking about ever since, how character isn't what you claim about yourself. It's what you do when it would be completely understandable to do otherwise. I didn't confront my parents because I wanted something from them. I did it because carrying the weight of knowing alone was slowly making me someone I didn't want to be. There's a kind of clarity that comes from saying the true thing out loud, even when the other person can't fully receive it. My mother cried. My father said, "We thought the fundraising was going well," which is one of the more devastating sentences I've ever heard from someone I love. But I said what was real and I left, and something shifted in me on the drive home that I don't have a better word for than relief. I think about what Nadia's illness asked of me over those months, the paperwork, the appointments, the fundraising, the phone calls, the keeping Eli's life as normal as possible while our world was coming apart. None of it was something I felt ready for. I just did it because it needed to be done and because she was my daughter and that was the only answer available. I didn't know at the time that I was building something in myself. You rarely do in the middle of it, but I think hard times either hollow you out or strengthen you, depending on what you decide to do with them. Not in a motivational poster sense, I mean it literally. Every time I chose to stay honest, to keep going, To not become bitter in a way that would have been completely justified. I was becoming more of the person I needed to be for Eli, for Callum, for myself. The hardest part wasn't forgiving my parents. The hardest part was accepting that what happened to Nadia was real and permanent, and that no confrontation or apology or donation to a hospital fund was ever going to change it. Some things don't resolve. They just become part of what you carry, and you learn to carry them without letting them define the whole of you. I still pass that hospital sometimes. I don't look away anymore. She would be 13 this spring. Every morning I make coffee and I start the day. That's what I've got. It turns out that's enough.